We are here now to talk about a panel that is really interesting to me, and it's an issue that I actually find myself struggling with from time to time, and that is building that relationship with the industry. So we've got an amazing panel here today, and when we four had a phone call on this to prepare for this, we could barely get off the phone because we had so many things to talk about. But I will let them each introduce themselves. Why don't you tell us your name and what you're doing, a little bit about your background.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dan Rowland. I'm actually the former Director of Public Affairs here with the City of Denver on Ashley's team, and was one of the people that put the original symposium together for the last few years, and it made me so happy to walk in here today and see all the work that was done to pull this thing off and not be a part of that at all. So it's nice to be here as a panelist. I am a consultant with a group called 420 Advisory Management, and we do education, we do medical cannabis advisory work, we do workplace health and safety, and we do lots of licensing, compliance, and investor due diligence work. So we cut across private sector, public, nonprofit, and we work in the UK, Canada, and the US. So it's nice to be home today.
My name's Andrew Friedman. First of all, thank you guys for the legacy of putting this together and you for continuing to put it together. I was the Director of Marijuana Coordination under Governor Hickenlooper for the rollout of what we call recreational and then the continued coding of medical marijuana. I have since left. I left almost 2 years ago to start a consulting firm called Friedman and Koski. The mission of that firm is simple. We are here to make legalization work with states that have chosen to go forward with it or countries that have chosen to go forward with it. In that vein, we don't work for industry or take industry money since we work directly for government. We've worked for a couple of you in the audience, but we also work for ancillary technologies, regulatory technologies that we think are important in this space. And so great to be here and great to start this conversation.
Hello, everyone. It's really hard to be the last panel between you and cocktail hours, so we're going to try to make it really lively for you. I'm Barbara Brohl, and up until about a year ago, I was the Executive Director for the Department of Revenue. I was appointed to that position in 2011 and regulated marijuana both first at the medical level and then at the adult use level up until I left. Pretty interesting concept. It was one of those things that if you've never had to really do this, you can't even imagine how interesting, rewarding, difficult, time-consuming, and costly it can be. So I really applaud all of you for coming and wanting to learn more. When I left, I began to consult as well. It's kind of like the thing that we do after state government and city government. And I have two goals. One of them is to actually do work with harm reduction, and so reducing harm is my shtick, and I do that through responsible regulation. And so what that means to me is if I can help a government figure out what responsible regulation looks like to them, or if I can help a business work through and become more responsible in its regulation, I'm really quite comfortable with that. Most recently, this last few months ago, I was in Amsterdam. I was part of their Transparent Chain conference and actually worked with some of the people that were advising the Dutch government. And most recently, and I'm going to encourage you all to take a look at it, I was an expert reviewer on the Global Commission for Drug Policy, their 2008 report, and it's called Regulation: The Responsible Control of Drugs. And it gives you a lot of information on how regulation can work. It's well reasoned. So I'm really glad to be here because one of the things that we dealt with at the state level was bringing the industry in and working with the industry. And so this concept of how to build partnerships, I think, is really important. Thank you.
Great. So we have about an hour and 15 minutes. So maybe we'll try to just sort of do a panel up here, a panel discussion for maybe about 45 minutes, and then open it up for questions. And before we get started talking about government's relationship with the industry, could we see how many people we have in here from the industry or people who are lobbyists or lawyers for the industry? Okay, great, great. And so we'll expect a lot of questions from you after this. So my first question I'll throw out to Dan. Do we as government need a relationship with the industries that we regulate?
Most definitely. And I think we accepted that fact right off the bat, at least from the city perspective. But building those relationships is easier said than done. And really getting to the meat of the operation and understanding what is going on in these facilities, in these businesses, what their corporate structures are like, and who are the people who are responsible for really running these businesses. I feel like it was hard sometimes as a regulator or someone, tasked with making this look good and making it work for the people of Denver to understand, who our counterparts within these businesses were. And I think that's an ongoing challenge to develop those relationships and keep them fruitful, especially as the industry grows, consolidates, contracts. There's turnover in a lot of these businesses, and it's important to kind of keep your finger on the pulse of what's going on in the businesses.
And so when we talk about the industry, do you guys want to share with us who you have seen and who those contacts have been, and the difference between communicating with business owners or lawyers or lobbyists, or what that whole world looks like?
Sure. I'll go ahead and go. I'm a regulatory attorney by trade, and so I was in telecom. And when you have a regulated industry, it's really important that you understand that the business knows what the business knows. And so as a regulator, it's important for us to really reach out and get to know that industry. One of the things that's really important is to bring people in and to have what we call working groups. And basically it's having everyone around the table, having everyone have a say, and to carefully consider what those issues are, because you might not think that a particular rule or regulation is going to create a lot of expense and cost to the industry, but it just might. And that's what happened when I was a regulatory attorney as well, is that the agencies that we worked with didn't really understand our business, and so there was a rule, there was a requirement, but in order for us to really comply, we could have come up with many different ways to do that. Now, what we tried to do when I was at the Department of Revenue was bring in the industry, people that were actually working, people that understood what the pain points are. Because, remember, I'm a lawyer, so I'm going to say something. Lawyers and lobbyists, they want to posture for their clients, and that's justifiable. However, if you can get the person who actually is running that particular product's manufacturer or running the cultivation to come in and work with you, you're going to have a lot better success than if you go the traditional route of lobbyist, lawyer types of interactions.
So, Andrew, from your standpoint, what do you think our relationship in Colorado and Denver has been with our industry, with the marijuana industry? And now that you've been traveling around, do you see any differences?
Yeah, first of all, I think all relationships between government and industry are bumpy, no matter if you're pro or anti or how you are. I mean, there's just going to be moments of growing pains between the government and between industry, and so expecting it to be a kumbaya moment all the time, I think you're probably fooling yourself. But one of the things, and I think both Barb and Ashley led the way on this, of setting the tone that that industry isn't evil on its face, right? That this is not. We are here as a compliance-forward type of organization and really looking for people who also want to protect public health and public safety and sure, make money, but are interested in doing it the right ways and really figuring out how to educate those people and how to get there. And I do think that is a tone that was struck early here. I think there was a lot of, during this time when I was there's a lot of frustration because people were putting money into regulatory, to meet certain regulatory standards that we might change 5 months later because we discovered something new. And I think during those frustrating times, these capital outlays of $500,000 that were suddenly kind of worthless for them, those were times where I really found that the working groups and creating kind of more personal connections with the industry ended up to be incredibly important, so that you could kind of socialize what's happening. It's nobody's fault that this is happening, but it is happening, that there are going to be bumps in the road. And the other thing I would add quickly to dovetail on Barb's point is, the smaller guys can't afford lobbyists and they can't afford lawyers. And so figuring out from government how you still have an ability to talk to that group who might not even have the time to come to a working group ends up to be a really important kind of secondary, constant turn of communication.
So, and how do you do that as government when you've got a lot of other things to do? How did you all make time for that, and what are some good effective ways of connecting with the industry or the smaller businesses?
Well, for the Department of Revenue, it started with a task force. If you all remember, the very first thing that happened after the November 2012 election was the governor set up by executive order the Amendment 64 Implementation Task Force. Along with Jack Finlaw, I had the opportunity to chair that, and that was a pretty amazing experience. And what we found, frankly, were two things. One, when you bring in very diverse viewpoints and you present them with challenges, it's amazing how they can all come together. The other thing is that when the industry, law enforcement, parents groups, the medical community, and government officials get together and sit around a room and they resolve the issue, it creates a couple of things. Number one, it creates kind of voluntary compliance and a lot more of that because there's buy-in. They feel like they've been heard and their issues have been carefully considered. And in addition, one of the things that it does is what we found was when we got to the hearing, there was very little, if any, opposition or even comments. So what we did is by putting the work up front, you actually saved a ton of work at the end because there weren't complaints afterwards, there weren't appeals afterwards. It just kind of was a little bit more smoothly implemented.
So, and I was not a regulatory attorney, and I had never overseen any other industry like this. And after about a year or so being in this, one of the things in talking to Department of Ag was talking about the nature of this industry being a lot different than others, or telecom when you had done it, or liquor that might have developed over a period of time. It wasn't like there was some new agricultural product that was coming to the market. And there had been people who had been working in this agriculture industry for a while, and they understood the processes they had to go through, and they understood they needed to get their pesticides approved, or they understood they needed to learn best cultivation practices. All of a sudden, here in Colorado, on January 1st, 2014, people could start growing weed, legally and get a license. And there had been no conversation about, well, what does that mean for what are those cultivation practices? What do we think about pesticides? What are we going to do with the fertilizing and all that stuff? So can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that also adds a different dynamic and angst with them moving quickly and us trying to catch up, and us all in this race.
I mean, in so many ways, this is set up for failure. No one's going to fail, everyone's going to succeed. But this is set up for failure because it's a regulatory system that's reaching maturity with an industry that's going through its maturity. I mean, everybody's starting off as infants here at the exact same time where there's a huge economic benefit for being first in the field and kind of grabbing as much as possible. And so that leads to so much angst and frustration because nobody knows yet, right? And so when we first started implementing pesticide regulations, which was, I will admit, a little after Denver first started implementing pesticide regulations. Even though they were on the books for a very long time before that point. I mean, a woman came into my office just crying that I'd taken away her kid's college fund because we had gone into that grow that day and put everything on hold because they had been using an illegal pesticide. And I think it's an important part about understanding your relationship with industry because it was really important for me to hear that, but it was also important to understand that as part of this process, not everyone's going to be part of the future part of industry as well. And it's a very difficult part of the conversation to be going through, but as the industry matures, consolidates, and learns to be highly regulated, it's not all of the people at the table who are going to be those people who figure that out. That you still have to listen to them, you still have to understand what you can do to help them become compliant, but you also have to realize that some of them aren't going to become compliant.
And I do think that's part of the root of some of the angst. Dan, how about you? And also I think the marijuana industry, the people who are in the marijuana industry, came from a different place than where maybe someone who's already a farmer growing soybeans and decides to switch to canola beans. Can you touch on that about kind of what the history might impact those relationships?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a big difference between someone who has been an advocate for, the civil right or the constitutional right to grow their own cannabis and provide medicine to someone versus someone who is looking to start a multinational corporation to, supply cannabis to the world. So Andrew touched on this. It's not necessary, the conversation and the people at the table at the beginning are not necessarily the same group of folks that you're going to be working with a year, 2 years down the line. I think what helped us was a general acceptance that we didn't know exactly what was best for the industry, and we didn't understand the processes that were taking place in the industry. I think having the industry in kind return some acceptance about not quite appreciating what the government's mandate is and what their roles and responsibilities for public safety are, goes a long way. And once we were able to sort of lower the temperature around those conversations and have this back and forth and this acceptance, the productivity of the regulatory development process became much, much better. The other piece to it was the accessibility, and I think Denver has always done an incredible job of being accessible to the industry. I think about what we're going through right now in terms of social consumption and trying to get those businesses licensed. If someone is thinking about doing it, the city says, come down, let's have a conversation about this. What's your business model? How can we figure this out together so that you're not investing years and hundreds of thousands of dollars into a business that's never going to comport with the regulatory framework that's been set up for it. So I think continuing to have those conversations really goes a long way.
It reminded me of a story when Dan told it. I was talking to one regulator who I don't think is regulating this anymore, and we were talking about how hard it is to get up and running with the seed to sale tracking, and that you should probably have some amount of dialogue between you as a department and the industry so that you can get them up and running and compliant on the seed to sale tracking software early on, and that probably is going to take a little bit of actual outward education. And the person said, well, it's just written into our statute that they have to do it, and so that's enough. And I think realizing that if you truly wanted to do it that way, you would be going after 30 different businesses every day and spending all of your time trying to essentially regulate with a stick, that you're going to have to go through court on that. You're going to have to go through the media on that. It's going to be, some $10 an hour employee who fat-fingered in something wrong, and suddenly that's where you're spending your time rather than an underage sting. And there's all these different things that I think if you just say, hey, we have the right policy and so we're fine, you're going to miss the fact that you're going to be spending all your time just chasing your tail and creating really bad communication between industry and the regulated powers at that point.
Well, I'd like to dovetail off that because I can't even imagine that comment. However, because it in a strange way, it becomes this really interesting little partnership. And if the regulator doesn't want to do the work to help the industry succeed, then that industry is not going to be compliant, and there's going to be a problem. And I have another funny little story, and that is that December, right before 1/1/14, when the industry had to have all of their RFID tags, and some ordered early and some did not. And you may not remember that, but in December of 2013, there was a huge ice storm in the southeast part of the country. And we were working with our particular vendor that was doing the seed to sale tracking system because UPS could not get their planes off the ground in Atlanta in order to provide, to send those RFID tags to Colorado, which meant that starting day one, a lot of the businesses were not going to be compliant. So we had to figure this out, and frankly, the CEO of that particular company, as there were 3 of us on the phone with him, said, I'll figure this out. And I kid you not, he probably went back and forth from Florida to Denver probably 5 times with 2 suitcases filled with RFID tags to come to Colorado so that we could distribute them so that the industry could start off as compliant as possible. So if you don't work with the industry and you just say that's the rule, I agree with you, that's problematic.
So Barbara, having experience overseeing a number of different regulated industries, what are the differences you see? Are the relationships better or worse with marijuana, or about the same, or do they all have their own challenges?
Well, they all have their challenges and they're all kind of different. Okay, so I regulated gaming, horse racing, liquor and tobacco, automotive dealers, and marijuana, as well as DMV, lottery, and state tax. And so what we did is when we built this program through the 2013 year timeframe, we looked at other things that we were doing. And so this Regulate Like Alcohol just doesn't work completely, but there are some things you can take from that. We used gaming as the major model because of the fact that we did background checks, we licensed all individuals, all employees, et cetera. But what I will tell you is this, and that is because of the fact that all those other industries have been regulated for a really long time, they understand that there is going to be regulation, and they understand that there is a status quo, but they also understand how to move forward with making and obtaining changes. The liquor industry, I mean, prohibition ended in liquor, 80, 90 years ago. There are still statutes that are changed every year at the state legislature here in Colorado. But there's a way to do that. And so there are things that can be done. And I think it goes back to those partnerships. I will tell you that the liquor industry would not move forward with a bill that was comprehensive without bringing the department in. And I will say that when these other industries, especially with the marijuana industry, when it does bring the department in and you work together on something, you're going to have a lot more success than if the regulators left out until it actually, language is written. So those are the kinds of things that I would say is that they're all a little bit, because when you're regulating an industry, you're kind of, there's some restrictions by its general nature. And what you have to do is find a way to work together.
So do any of you have any particularly good instructive stories in dealing with the industry, with relationships, either where something turned out really good or really bad, poorly?
I've got a great one. During a debate, the governor was going for re-election, and during one of the debates, he was in a sizable audience, and for some reason, he called marijuana legalization reckless, and not to say like he was against legalization, but the word reckless was actually, it's pretty hard to say something that was passed by a vote of the people was reckless, and it was certainly, I think, a misstep in a number of different ways. But I was sitting at my computer, and suddenly I just saw like a headline tweet or something come down at the bottom of the computer. And oh, that's going to be a thing. And I went into the communications director's office and I said, so did you know that the governor said that? And like, well, he said it, but he kind of said it in a funny way. Like he was kind of being joking, Hickenlooper. And I was like, that's not how it's going to go over in the industry. And so I spent the next day calling all of the people that I knew in the industry and just saying, I'm not going to be an apologist for this. I'm just going to tell you this is what happened, and so that you hear it from us rather than hearing it from anybody else. And I'm happy to take any comments you have constructively to the governor about why that is that might have upset you, and what you would want him to know about that. And I won't say that was a solve in any way. I will say it was necessary to be able to come up to them later and continue to have conversations during more constructive times in the world. I mean, I went online at some point. I saw there was a giant Facebook thread of people Andrew Friedman has called and haven't called, and so they were using it kind of like against each other in industry, and people were lying too. I was like, I didn't call that person, and it was like certainly that. All of that was just unpleasant. It was an unpleasant time. It didn't become better because I called everybody. It was better 6 months later when we were dealing with a completely separate issue that they knew that they had been listened to during the time where it wasn't fun.
And I can give you one as well, not quite that high profile, but equally as impacting. We had rules on edibles at one point, and what we had to do was we identified that they had to be in single serving sizes or they had to have some other restrictions. And so what we did is we identified, per se, what were the things that could be in single servings. Other things would have to then be able to be identifiable, and you could easily identify what a serving size was. So in other words, think of a candy bar that I'm not going to mention a name, but you could easily break it off, and that would tell you what one dose was. Well, with liquids, you couldn't do that easily, but we didn't in the statute, and that's where, when you write statutes, you have to really realize what they do and whether there are intended or unintended consequences. We didn't have the leeway of exempting liquids or bulk foods. So they had to be then single serving sizes. I had an individual from the industry come in and talk to me, and he said, here's what we do, and he showed me all of the different packaging and said, here's what we do with regard to ensuring that it stays child resistant and a number of things, and how it remains safe. Well, he had, and this is why it's going to be really, really difficult for us to do, and I'm going to read something to you really quickly. In Amendment 64, it says that the state licensing authority, which is what I was, has a prohibition to make regulations that would make the operations of an industry member unreasonably impracticable. Basically, what that meant is you can't do things that cause them to go out of business. And essentially what he said is, this will cause us to go out of business. So I thought about that a while, and what we finally decided to do was move the implementation date of that portion of the rule to after the legislative session. And then they had the ability to go in and make changes, and then we would know what legislative intent was, because if the legislature made that modification, great, and if they didn't, great, and then we would know. They ultimately made those changes, and this individual was very appreciative of the fact that by having access to the regulator and by having the same common goal, which was safety and the ability to have a compliant product, they were able to get what they wanted done.
I would love to add a couple stories. So are there any elected officials here, city council members maybe? Oh, thank you so much for being here. Truly, because I think it's all of our responsibility in this room today to take this information back to our elected leaders and try to share some of this education. So I'm still going to pick on some city council members. I was in front of the mayor and the 23 city council members of the city of Calgary. I talked for at least an hour about the Denver experience, all the lessons learned, everything we'd been through, and one of the council members asked me, so we're talking about selling cannabis in stores? Is that going to be legal? And I was, yeah, that's why I'm here today. That's why you nice people brought me here today. But it was really illuminating to say, wow, okay, just because we're close to this, right? We think about the policy, we think about the regulations so much every day, sometimes take for granted what other people are actually thinking about that have a lot of other responsibilities. City of Boston, same thing. One council member just pulled me aside and said, how do I make this go away? Again, that's not really an option at this point, but there are things you can do to get involved. And then, real quickly, an attorney general of a province I will not name in Canada, I was basically saying, what are your biggest concerns? What can we help with to get this kicked off correctly? And her biggest concern was her dog ingesting cannabis. So, not to discount that, that is a concern, but of all the things an attorney general needs to think about. So. I think it's all of our responsibility to educate the folks we work with about this and to understand what's coming and how to develop it.
So one of the things that I've seen and been frustrated with over the years has been sort of a lack of trust, and probably both ways. But a lack of trust maybe building on the fact that the governor called this reckless, or, a mayor or a council person might have initially been against legalization, or you're a person who said, how do I make this go away? So with that kind of backdrop, then I see the industry sort of not trusting government. And then over the years, when we're working and doing all these different things and continuing just even having the mayor set up our mayor's office of marijuana policy and having, a high level of focus on it, continuing to run up against that sort of every time we make a decision, there still seems to always be the thought that we're hiding something or not being fair. And I really kind of struggle with where that comes from. Thoughts? I have some thoughts, but.
I would like to hear your thoughts.
Sure. Well, one of the things, what you were saying, Dan, about people having maybe initially been advocates and then moving into, being business owners who are regulated. Maybe it is part about being new and being a change agent, or even taking it further than that, being somebody who's anti-establishment and really doing something different that's really important to them. And then we as a government can be viewed as, right, the man, the person that they had been fighting all the time. So I wonder how much of that sort of long history there has been related to legalization and illegalization and getting to where we are still continues to play into these communications and relationship issues we have.
Yeah, I think in some ways this whole thing is, to be clear, like a little Sisyphean, right? This is pushing a big boulder up the hill. At the end of the night, it is going to roll that back down the mountain. Like, that is going to happen here, and it's still a worthwhile exercise, both because your policy gets better when you're talking and your enforcement gets better when you're actually talking with industry and you understand them, but also because you are essentially socializing everything you're doing. You're saying, here's the mission we're pushing for every day, and that's not just so that the industry knows it's the mission, it's so public health experts know it's your mission, so the populace knows it's your mission, so the Denver Post knows it's your mission, and part of doing that is talking directly to industry, and even if they're not, you're not doing it so that at the end of the day they're less of a pain in your butt. There's kind of no way in which industry is not going to be a pain in your butt. You're doing it because you're furthering your mission. And that's the single reason you're doing it. And in fact, if you're, which I want to get into later, if you're doing it so that they're nice to you, you should be worried about regulatory capture. So, I gained a lot of solace in it that when people, even though I was reaching out and trying to be an active partner with industry, and they were still mean to me, or it still was just a pain in the butt, that everything I was doing was still in furtherance of the mission. And so I wasn't doing it to become friends. And that helped, okay, I'm going to go have a drink at the end of the night, but I do still feel good about the stuff I'm doing, even if these people are mad at me.
So I think part of the lack of trust comes from when you don't know what the other person's goals are, you don't know what their positions are, and you don't know how to get to them. So one of the things that I will tell you is that that's where, as you're starting to hear a common theme here, and that is communication. And you're going to continue to hear it, at least from me and I think from all of us. And so as a regulator, if your door is open and industry can come in and talk to you, and they can come in and they can address issues and they can work through things, you're going to have a lot more success in having them ultimately begin to trust you. Now, that doesn't mean that you just say, okay, come here and I'm going to do everything that you want, because at the end of the day, as a regulator, you have a job to do. You have a goal, you have a mission, as Andrew said, and you have to move forward with that mission. You have to find a way to come together. Now, you're not always going to agree. In fact, many times you will not agree and you will disagree, and maybe even disagree vehemently, and maybe they'll disagree to the point where they go to the legislature, or they go and they ask for different things. But the point is that if your door is open, if you listen, if you carefully consider, and you're objective, and that's the other thing that I required of my staff, was because I was a state licensing authority, which meant I had to be the objective one. I was the only one that didn't really get to take a position, because I got to decide whether or not there were sanctions, I got to decide appeals, those kinds of things, and so I had to be objective. And one of the things I asked of my staff was, especially I had a lot of law enforcement working for me, you have to put your personal views and leave them at the door. When you walk into this office, you have to follow the law, even if you don't agree with the law. And that was the same issue with the industry. They have to follow the law as well, even if they don't agree to it. So I guess bottom line, it's communication to me. the lack of communication breeds mistrust, and more communication, I think, assists with that.
So we've talked about the necessity for having a good relationship. We've talked about some of the problems that we've seen. We've talked about the issue of trust, and we've talked about some solutions, as Barbara's talked about communication, or Andrew's talked about dealing directly with the business owners, large and small, maybe understanding the role of lobbyists and lawyers and being objective. So let's talk about what Andrew's wanted to talk about as you start making those strides. And as I've seen also, I mean, a lot of the people in the industry are great people. I've developed some real friendships within the industry, because they're change agents and out there, they're kind of exciting and fun to be with. And then I've also met these wonderful people. But what is the next step after we've sort of had these run-ins and this trust issue? What are your thoughts, Andrew?
Yeah, so this is the one I'm been thinking about the most. I think when we go to the 8th annual Denver Marijuana Symposium, the thing we'll have a session on regulatory capture. And to define regulatory capture a little bit, that's that it essentially becomes easier, if not personally beneficial, to do what industry wants you to do, and so that what essentially it means is industry has captured the regulatory agency that's looking over it. And there's two main dynamics that lead to regulatory capture in other regulated industries, and I think you will see displayed here. First is life is easier if you agree with industry. They're the ones with the biggest lobbying power. They're the ones with the most direct access to other elected officials. They will be calling up the Denver Post the fastest. The second is, none of us are independently wealthy when we come in, and we're growing in expertise, and a lot of people at the end of the day use that expertise in industry. And so kind of the more you do to upset industry while you're inside the regulatory house, maybe the harder it will be to get a job when you're outside of the regulatory house. And you'd like to say nobody who ever works inside a regulated industry for the regulated body can ever go and work for industry. I think that would be a good way of making sure you don't have any regulators going forward. I do think there's a couple of things. I'm a little bit on a soapbox right now, so everybody, just so you know. I do think there's a couple of things you can do on the front end that really will set up a better battle, because I think the history of all regulated industry is that you're going to have this battle, and the pendulum is going to swing between being too mean to industry and being way too nice to industry. That's just the way regulated industry often works. But first is, again, some of the basics. The clearer and more outspoken you are about your mission, the more you can bring it back to that at the end amongst the group of people making a decision. And so for us, we created a mission that we went over every day during our marijuana working group, which was it was the 10 department leads across Governor Hickenlooper's administration that all had something significant to do for cannabis legalization. And we just wrote it, and it was right there that said, we are here to create an efficient, effective market while maintaining public health and public safety and keeping marijuana out of the hands of kids. That's our only goal. That's why we're here. And in that, when you had to come with policy suggestions to that group, you had to justify why it is that it met those goals. And you were filled with people who didn't have to worry about regulatory capture because they weren't in that sphere. And so having to face those people who you respect and who frankly have a lot of power, having to face them and justify your policies in their face is really important. So if you are siloed right now in your governorship of how you are, in your governance plan of how you're overseeing marijuana, make sure there's a point where you have to justify everything to a broader audience inside your own group, because you will get caught in regulatory capture without even knowing it. The second one is, we've said it's really important to meet face-to-face with a lot of this industry. It's also really important to continue to meet face-to-face with everybody else as well. And I know it's a very big time commitment, but you have to be meeting with the head of your children's hospital. Mm-hmm. You have to be meeting with the sheriffs and chiefs, and you have to be meeting with the home growers. And they're essentially, you have to justify your policy and look everybody in the eyes and tell them why you're doing what you're doing all the time. And that will also drag it out. And then lastly, there are just sets of best practices about regulatory capture, especially for the enforcement agencies about rotating your staff and making sure that they're not with one industry member too often, about making sure that they are reporting up in the right ways, so that they are having to justify their decisions, et cetera. But I would urge people to look into regulatory capture from other industries and best practices when you think about how you utilize your staff.
Having been involved in the enforcement side of the regulation of industries, especially those that, they're not anestheticians and they're not, telecom, it's gambling, it's horse racing, it's marijuana, it's liquor, those kinds of things. One of the things that has been, and even the lottery that was set in each of these enabling statutes, was a statutory cooling off period. Some of them are 2 years, and let me tell you, by the time you're out of that agency for 2 years, you've pretty much lost a lot of your the enticement of going to that industry. There's no regulatory capture at that point any longer. Some are as low as 6 months. And with the Marijuana Enforcement Division and anyone who worked directly for the state licensing authority, that was a 6-month cooling off period. So one of the things that you can also do is best practices, but you can also put something in, so in case you're, as a belts and suspenders with your best practices, so that there is actually a cooling off period before anybody can go to work in this industry or in any of the industries that you regulate, or before they can actually do that.
So we're going to be moving into questions pretty soon, but before we do, Dan, after hearing all of this, what do you think the future, how does the future look for us government regulators working with the industry and having that good relationship with each other?
We're in a tremendous position of power, I think, to share with regulators in new emerging markets about the lessons learned here. I am consistently amazed with the way that we go back to square one in each one of these markets. And so I think that there's going to be a globalization of this industry. I don't think that's a shocking statement. And it's up to governments, I think, to decide in their marketplaces what are the priorities. Do we want to tailor policies to have more independent mom and top type of operators? Do we want to see that infusion of institutional financing? Do we think that helps professionalize the interest or the industry? What are the balances there? And it's quite easier said than done. Consolidation will happen, but it's not happening at the rate that some might expect it to. And there is an ability for more independent operators to be successful in this industry long term. But that has to come with some support from government policy and government regulation. If we are designing regulations for these businesses, and we want to see the guys that can't afford lobbyists and lawyers succeed, we have to design the regulations with them in mind and help them stay compliant and be successful going forward.
So anything else from our panel members before I open up for questions?
I could talk more about regulatory capture.
We'll
No,
get
just-
back, we'll do that over cocktails. Okay, so do we have any questions? Like I said, I know Kevin Gallagher, I know we need you to come up to the microphone. Kevin is a really well-known and well-respected lobbyist and business owner here in Denver, and works on our Health and Safety Advisory Committee, and has been somebody who's always been at the table with us, so.
Hey, my name is Kevin Gallagher. I'm the Director of Compliance and Government Affairs with Craft Concentrates, and I'm also the Executive Director of the Cannabis Business Alliance, both of which are located here in Colorado. So this is a two-part question. Andrew, you briefly stated that small businesses can't afford lobbyists. With that, how important is it for businesses to join an industry group? Two, when consulting for governments, do you or other panel members suggest to governments that they should be working closely with industry groups?
So I've set up a pitch for you. Yes, I do believe that it is important to be in an industry group where you can consolidate your voice and be heard, especially if you can't afford a lobbyist. I say that of my own free will. I've never taken $1 from any Cannabis Business Alliance or any other person, but it is of necessity, especially if you're a small business owner. And the second is we suggest a robust stakeholder outreach regardless of where you're going, and have found that when we're doing that, there's no stopping industry from talking to you, and we welcome it, but they will come and knock on your door once they realize that they're allowed to. Our biggest complaint about industry is they will knock on our door and come and want a special meeting with us, but they don't always show up to the stakeholder groups. So I'll give you an example. We're working with a lot of small cities in California, and everybody's concerned about equity. And one of the things you need to have equity is you need to expand the number of licenses. Well, current business owners don't want to expand the number of licenses. We want to have that discussion in front of everybody. But they want to come through the back door and have the discussion about why they don't want to see any more licenses. Industry has to figure out that if they want some unpopular policies, or if they want to protect what's theirs currently, they have to justify that in front of everybody else, just like anything else. And so I'm absolutely for having open dialogue with industry, but I would like it to be as in a public format as possible.
And I'm going to agree with that, because I will tell you that in the other industries that I regulated, there was a lot of, coming and talking to my staff and saying, this is what I want, and then being very quiet. And so then it became viewed that my staff was being heavy-handed. And so I finally just said, look, this is something I should do when I was a litigator, and everybody carries their own water. And if it's not in the open, if it's not on the record, as the state licensing authority, I cannot consider that comment when it comes time to establish rulemaking or anything else. And once I made that very, very clear, it's interesting how people did start to put more and more things on the record. And I just didn't acknowledge that. I'm sorry, if you're not going to put it on the record, I can't review that, and I can't evaluate it.
And I think too, Kevin, one thing I'd say, I remember Molly and I have struggled in the past trying to reach out to the industry and sort of find out what their direction was. And we couldn't get a consistent answer even among, we have 2, maybe 3 industry groups here in Denver, but even within those industry groups, we weren't getting the same answer. Right. Or I'd get an answer from an executive director, but then the person who was on the board of directors gave a different answer. So, and I wonder what is the cause of that. Is it because it's a new industry? And maybe not everybody's aligned. And I'd be interested to know, is the automobile industry, would they be more aligned? Would they be more inclined to speak with one voice? So do you have any thoughts on that for us?
No, I completely agree with exactly what you said. If industry isn't coming to the table and making their comments public, then I don't think they really should deserve the time behind closed doors. So, and with your question, Ashley, that is a wonderful question as well. I think maybe that is due to the industry being young and probably fairly disorganized, but I think as it matures, you're absolutely going to have more consistency within the industry group itself. And I would imagine that in the future, you would start seeing more industry-specific, focused industry groups as well, rather than overarching industry groups that represent all sorts of licensees, cultivators, manufacturing facilities, labs, et cetera. I think you're going to have groups that are really going to be there for specifically manufacturing facilities, specifically there for cultivators, specifically there for dispensaries as well.
Great, thank you. And one other comment, Barbara, I've just started attending some of the liquor work groups, and they had, how many different liquor industry representatives are there? There's the bars, there's the distilleries.
Well, you have in on-premises consumption, which are bars, taverns, those kinds of restaurants, and then you have off-premises, which are, liquor stores. But then you have craft brews, and you have, the ciders, and you have all these different things. And that's why I say every year there's more and more legislation around alcohol, but absolutely there are a number of different kinds. Plus there's also the distributor versus the manufacturer versus the retail side. And it's so diverse and dispersed that, there's a lot.
But at least within those groups, they're consolidating what their ask is, maybe.
Well, yeah,
sometimes.
so like the tavern group will get together and talk about what they want to do, because generally they have the same kind of initiatives that they want to see going forward. The on-premises or off-premises, they'll do the same thing. I think it's because this is such a nation industry. I mean, a lot of them, they just want to fix what my problem is right here, as opposed to thinking long-term about policy and future of the industry.
Okay, Brooke?
What do you think that regulators can do to increase transparency and then, somewhat related, improve communication with the industry? Or sorry, increase transparency government-wise and then improve communication to the industry?
I'll try. Having a consistent kind of feedback mechanism, I think, is the biggest point for the communication piece of that question. Because this industry moves lightning fast and because the regulations are sort of playing catch up, we're doing policy development and regulatory development on almost a weekly, monthly basis versus something where it's like an annual cycle. And so having a single point of contact or someone who's, responsible for being that public-facing liaison with industry certainly helps. Again, I've run into this a number of times, and it changes, right? People get put on the file for a month, and then their boss says, okay, you're going to go work on, off-track betting now or something like that. So, but making that a priority in the government structure to have that communications person, I think helps.
I would add, as many things as kind of working against you in the dynamic of trying to start a regulated industry, the one thing that's working for you is the media is very interested, and you can actually push out the socialization of a new policy through media, and they will cover it, and everybody will actually read it. I mean, that is actually, if you did that, if you changed auto dealership something tomorrow, it wouldn't be the front page of the Denver Post, and that's in your favor for the first couple of years to really open up the transparency of the whole thing.
I say get involved as well. At every working group that the Marijuana Enforcement Division has, there's also, or even of the other divisions within the Department of Revenue has had, there's an opportunity for public comment. So even if you're not selected to be part of that working group that is talking for the majority of that meeting, there is time set aside at the end for public comment. There's also the ability to provide comment after the fact in written form. So, just keep trying to be involved in that. I would say that that's what the industry needs to do. I would say the regulator just needs to be open about those things, have things out on a website, have transparent processes, make sure that you are developing rules based on the record and not based on, viewpoints. And so those are the kinds of things that you really want to encourage.
All right, yes?
Hello. Hey, first off, Andrew, thank you so much for the explanation about regulatory capture. I thought that was really, really good and detailed. My question isn't on that issue so much as how, when you guys have been focused on the details, you step back and see the forest. I'm worried, since both you and Barbara have left. For example, we have a situation in Colorado where we sell recreational marijuana in asthma inhalers. And when I talk to people out of state who are in states that are legalizing marijuana, they think that's crazy. And sometimes you're so thick in the industry, you might have lost some objectivity about, maybe it goes back again to your question, do you keep your mission at the forefront every day of the decision-making process? But I'm also worried that you just get too far in, you almost lose the sensitivity to the subject.
Yeah, I think I have a deeply philosophical answer to it that I'm not sure I have a functional answer to it, which is that this is a constant reawakening process, right? And I actually think more than anything, it's about creating helpful turnover, especially at the top, as often as possible. Because I will tell you, by the time I left, I was so fiercely protective of everything I had done at that point that I had lost track of a lot of things. I mean, 6 months out, I started to realize some things I absolutely would have changed had I had better insight during the time there. You know, I wish there was a permanent solution to how you make sure that you're continuing to think about good government every day. But I think it's beholden on, you know, we would meet all the time, and you would just chastise me, and then we would have a good conversation, and then, you know, that you just can't stop doing that part. And I know it's frustrating that we're all having to push that way all the time, but I think that's the way it has to be.
I would say in the city that our agencies help also keep us accountable. You know, we were the Office of Marijuana Policy. Now we're in excise and licenses, so we oversee a bunch of different licenses. So there is more of that, okay, this is just another license like everything else. They don't necessarily need to have all this additional handholding, although maybe they still do because they're new. But then on a weekly basis, we sit down, our office, with a representative from environmental health, a representative from zoning, a representative from the police department, a representative from fire. And we talk about what we're seeing sort of on a day-to-day basis. And then once a month, and sometimes that'll wind up being every other month, we'll actually have those employees at the table with us. And it's the employees who are saying, hey, did you know about marijuana nose drops? And that kind of stuff makes us, you know, makes us all just kind of refocus on where we are and be accountable and who needs to call whom and what's going on with this and what is the answer. So kind of from our standpoint, I would say it's all the great employees in Denver who really are focused on doing the right thing all the time. Thank you. Okay. Anyone else? Sure.
Hi. So my name's Julianne, and you had touched a bit on liquor. And you know, one of the things, I'm from the state of Connecticut, and we are looking to evolve from a medical program to a recreational one. And you know, our medical program is quite robust, and it is based on, you know, it's treating marijuana as a Schedule II drug. Now, you hear a lot of conversations in other states about how when they are looking to recreationalize, the dialogue primarily revolves around recreational being treated more like alcohol. Now, have you seen, when you've dealt with other states, kind of an impact of making the comparison? Do you think it's a good comparison when states are looking at it in that view, or?
So, in Colorado, the campaign was regulate marijuana like alcohol. Well, let me tell you, that ship sailed probably the day after the election. There was no way that we were going to be able to do that. And luckily my team, because you know, we were called out in the amendment to do that implementation. And so one of the individuals who worked for me, his name is Ron Camerzal, and we sat there and we were thinking about this before the election, and we started talking about that. The only part of legalizing and regulating like alcohol is that you must be 21. Because quite honestly, everything else was more like gaming. Gaming, you do extensive financial background checks. You look to see where the money came from. You look to see where the money's going to. And that's what we did in with the Marijuana Enforcement Division. That's what was part of the rule. In gaming, there are actually lifetime bans for someone who has a gambling conviction and they cannot get into the industry. With marijuana, we had a ban, but it was much less, and it's continued, you know, over the years to get lessened, more and more lessened. The other thing is that there were extensive criminal fingerprint-based background checks. None of those things happen in the liquor industry, let's face it. And you don't have to have, you're licensed, but the business is licensed. The other thing was every individual who worked in that industry, in the marijuana industry, had to be licensed. They also underwent a criminal background check. So those were all the things that we actually employed in order to have a robust process. The other thing was this is a largely cash industry. And so what we did was we did two things. Number one, we ensured that as we were bringing in cash, that we took some additional things from gaming, because casinos are largely cash as well, and we had dual counting rooms and dual controls and things like that, so that when cash came into the department, we could certify that that was the cash that went to the state treasurer. In addition, the state tax group was within that department as well. They both teams looked at the metric system, so the inventory tracking system, and could tell whether or not there was marijuana that had been transferred from one location to another by using that seed to sale RFID tracking system, and then did appropriate taxation occur. Interestingly enough, those of you who are involved in tax, one of the things that you'll think is kind of unusual is that we also set up a process by which 100% of the industry was tax audited every 3 years. That's unusual as can be, because generally it's about a 20 to 25% type of number, and it's usually based on certain criteria. So with all of those things, we actually built a program that was a little bit different, as you can probably see, than regulate like alcohol. So my advice is going to be, you can't really regulate this industry like alcohol. You can't regulate because it's still illegal at the federal level. There are other issues to deal with. And in addition, you also have to figure out what are the kinds of things that the federal government used to do or does for other industries that it doesn't do for this industry. You know, the reason that the Department of Ag had to get involved with pesticide use and pesticide control, and why Denver had to get involved with it so much, was because the Environmental Protection Agency doesn't address pesticides. The FDA doesn't deal with dosages and contraindications. So our Department of Public Health and Environment had to do a lot of that work. So what you're going to have to think about is that there are a lot of things, and banking is the big one. That's the obvious one that everyone talks about. But frankly, I was able to get cash. I was able to get EFTs. I was able to get a lot of stuff for all the taxation money that came into this state, and it worked really well. The other issues were the ones that were probably the most problematic, because we didn't know how to do those as a state. I know about your regulatory program for medical in Connecticut. I just met with an individual earlier last week in Texas, and how you were able to do it was really a key thing as well, and it's because you did it through your legislature. And Andrew and I have had this conversation many times. Whoever designs the program designs the program. So by doing it through your legislature can make modifications. In Colorado, it's done through an amendment to our Constitution. So the only way to make structural changes to things that we may or may not have liked in the amendment, like home grows, can only be done through another constitutional amendment. So that's the kind of thing that you really want to think about when you're thinking about legalizing.
The one real quick thing I would add is regulate like alcohol is a slogan. I think at the end of the day, just what's your mission and what are the best practices from anywhere that you can grab in order to get there, whether that's prescription drugs, tobacco, alcohol. I mean, it's a grab bag, and we should learn as much as we can from every one of them. The one pushback you're going to get is, well, you don't treat alcohol like that. And I think it's important then to push back and say, this isn't a person. It doesn't get equal protections like alcohol. The user, sure. Like, we've now determined that we shouldn't be punishing the user of marijuana, but marijuana doesn't have rights. And so if we learn something that we should have done different than from alcohol, we're going to apply that different thing if it's going to lead to a better public health outcome.
Okay, not to pile on, but you also can't regulate recreational cannabis like medical cannabis, and so we'll leave that for another day.
Yeah,
but
but I totally agree with
the way that distribution and sale of the products are heading, it's going to be very different.
Totally agree.
We have another question here.
Thanks. Jeff Cox, Illinois Department of Agriculture. I'm facing a lot of cultivators that are suddenly going public with these IPOs in Canada, and it's already caused some challenges when it comes to disclosure of ownership, and I don't have access to all the records and what have you. And I'm just curious as to either your experiences or your thoughts on the future for the relationships between the regulators and the regulated community as these companies continue to get bigger and bigger and go, not just nationally but worldwide. Thanks.
Yeah, we've seen from my experience in Canada a pretty deep dive on the corporate structures of these entities, and so I think you have to demand that transparency. You also have to commit resources to following up on that and requiring the disclosures when ownership structure changes. I think it benefits everyone to understand who's behind these businesses, and building that into the regulations for doing business is completely fair in my mind. But it takes a lot of legwork on your end.
And to that, I mean, there is, I think one of the reasons and part of the brilliance of Barb's rollout has been walk before you run. So if your department's not set up to handle that at this point and doesn't have the expertise, I think that's a valid argument for why it shouldn't happen. I mean, it doesn't mean that you can't come back the next year and have that conversation. But if you're like, hey, we're struggling to do fingerprints on the 5 ownership structure we had before, you can come back. Now, I think they also have valid arguments that they need ways to exit their own businesses. They need access to legitimate capital. And so that's not an end all. You can't just say that we're overwhelmed and we can never do this. You have to say what's a reasonable path to get there.
Okay, great. Do we have any more questions? All right, well, thanks for being here. We're excited about the networking event. Be aware, is that on the 4th floor? Oh, it's just right out here. So great, so thanks. I hope you had a good day today and learned a lot, and we'll see you at the networking event. Thank you.